You're listening to the Vint Wine Podcast, where you'll hear interviews and stories from around the wine world. From writers and critics to winemakers and sommeliers, we'll explore the people and businesses who are instrumental in shaping wine culture. Enjoy the show.
Hey everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Vint Wine Podcast. I am your host, Billy Galanko, and we have a fantastic episode for you today. We have great friend of the program, William Kelley. For those of you who are newer to the podcast, we had William Kelley on a bit over a year ago. So definitely go check out our first interview with him. And since then, I've helped or mainly observed him pruning his vines in Burgundy in March. It was great to have him back on the podcast to catch up, hear everything that's going on with the Wine Advocate. And he's just such a wealth of wine knowledge that it was an amazing interview. But before we get to our interview today, I wanted to thank everyone who reached out regarding the possible wine news segment. I got a lot of positive notes saying that you guys would be interested in a news segment that is separate from the main podcast. So we will be spinning that out in the fall. I'm hoping to have it out in September for you guys. It'll depend on a few different circumstances, but we will definitely be creating that. So thank you again for reaching out on Instagram and otherwise. And speaking of Instagram, when you are hearing this, I will be on my way to Switzerland and Italy. I hope to take some photos of some fantastic scenery as well as some wines that I get to taste. I'm really excited to taste some Swiss wines while I'm over there. I had a couple fun wines over the weekend and forgot to take photos, a brilliant Tissot and another wine from the Jura. So hopefully I'll be better at taking photos on this trip. So stay tuned for some exciting Swiss and Northern Italian photos. But for now, with the news not being a separate segment yet, we will do a couple quick news articles. And these are two that I really just thought they're more of an FYI rather than news happenings per se. The first article is titled, "Can Alcohol Labels Be Trusted?" Now, this is just a PSA that I wanted to share with everyone because I have wine friends who aren't actually up to speed with some of these wine regulations regarding alcohol percentage. So in the US, if a wine is below 14%, there is a 1.5% wiggle room on the alcohol that can be listed on the label. For example, if a wine is labeled 12.4, it could be anywhere between 13.9 and what would that be? 10.9 degrees alcohol. It's just a wiggle room that they have in the system. A lot of wine producers take it to the extreme sometimes. Some of them aren't very specific with the amount of alcohol in there. And part of that reasoning is because over a certain percent in the US in particular, you get taxed. So if it's over 14 degrees alcohol, you only have one degree wiggle room. So if a wine's labeled 14, it may be 15%. So basically, a lot of wineries want to label their wine, fall within the rules, number one. And number two, make sure that final is below 14% so they don't incur a higher tax rate. For EU wines that are sold in the EU, the wiggle room is only 0.5%. So if you're buying a wine while you're in Europe, it is much more likely to be very much closer to what the actual alcohol is in the bottle. And this doesn't just go for wines, American wines that are made here and sold here. Any wine that's being imported to the US just has to follow these parameters as well. So you could have an Italian wine, for example, that is also labeled 12.4 and is really 13.9. That's just the laws in our country. So that's also why you might see on some importer labels a range of alcohol, possible alcohol in the bottle. And that way they can basically fall within legal limits without having to put in a very specific alcohol from the producer. The second article for today is another PSA, and it's something that I didn't really know when I first got into wine. And the more I got into wine, the more I appreciate it. And it is called The Science of Blending Wine. And the real driver behind this for me is that all wine, like when I first started drinking wine, I was like, oh, I only want a single variety. I don't want any of that blended wine. And I think there's a stigma that happens in the US for whatever reason about blended wines, even though some of the best wines in the world are traditionally blends, like the top gross in Bordeaux, for example, are all blends of different varieties. But when you peel back the onion a little bit more, almost everything is a blend, whether it be different varieties that are blended together, different plots of the vineyard that are blended together, or wines that are aged in different ways. Something maybe spent time in stainless steel, whereas something else was aged in oak vessels, or maybe something was vinified or fermented in oak, whereas they might have had another piece or parcel that was vinified or fermented in steel. all of these can give different mouthfeels and different flavors, aromas, and a ton of things to contribute to the wine. And this is all part of the winemaker really building his palate so that you have a lot of different colors, if you will, to play with when you're making your final artwork. So you have a lot of different wines with different textures, aromatic intensities, and maybe even some cases alcohol, depending on the vessel that they were fermented in. So you can combine and blend these. So it's not just variety. It could be all single variety Cabernet Sauvignon, but that was a carefully crafted blend of different parcels and just a lot of thoughtful decisions that went into it in the winery. For everybody this week, I really just wanted to share those two high level things because I think it's something that when I first got into wine, I wish somebody explained to me a little bit more. For those of you that are in wine and have been drinking for decades, that might not be news to you, but I hope some of those are fun little facts that you can share at the cocktail parties. All right, now let's get to our interview with William. It was great to catch up with him. It's the first time we actually had a full interview with him since he became editor-in-chief of the Wine Advocate. We touch on a really wide range of topics, including updates that he's making to the team at the Wine Advocate, just wine in general, how the global wine scene is trending, things that he's seeing out there. And he's also just a wealth of knowledge. He started studying history and is passionate about wine history just like I am. And he's able to taste so many vintages over the years that he has this Rolodex of wine knowledge that's just incredible to tap into. So I spent a lot of this episode just sitting back and listening, and I hope you all enjoy the conversation as much as I did. So for now, without further ado, here is the editor-in-chief of the Wine Advocate, William Kelley. Hey, William, thanks so much for joining today.
Oh, thanks for having me back.
Yeah, great to see you. Last time I was able to see you, we were in your vineyard with Tom and Allie. So thank you so much again for letting me join you guys for that time.
That was a pleasure. Yeah, it's a little while ago now. The vineyards are now pretty big, 2-3 meter high canopies and growing like crazy. It's so far a beautiful season here.
Oh, wow. Well, good to hear. We'll get a little bit more into vintages later. But since we last had you on, you've become the editor-in-chief at the Wine Advocate. So I really wanted to kind of dive in here. I think if anybody needs a little bit more background on who you are, how you got into wine, they can listen to our first episode. But I'd love to hear a little bit about, I guess, the recent years at the Wine Advocate and how you're changing or maybe not changing anything.
Oh, yeah. So we've been doing quite a lot of things behind the scenes that people may not have seen. So the priority is always to keep on providing the service that our subscribers are paying for. We try not to interrupt that in any way, but we've made a few new hires. My colleague Erin Larkin in Australia, who's been doing a great job in the Southern Hemisphere, is very dynamic and very productive. I think also reviewing a lot of wines that people outside Australia don't necessarily have too much access to, but I would love to taste more myself. We have Matthew Lucci, who's based in LA, former head sommelier of Melis, which is an LA2 staff for quite a while. Somebody who I wanted to have worked with us for a long time, so I'm really pleased he came on board. I think he has a very bright future and wine criticism. Somebody who's not afraid to take hard decisions and give frank criticism of wines that haven't necessarily been considered above criticism. So I'm very happy to have him there. And then there's also, of course, I don't know if you've been reading his work, but Johan Castin. So the first French native critic at the Wine Advocate. He's based in Bordeaux. He's doing Bordeaux with me collaboratively. So that's another new development. We can get onto that. But also the Rhône, the Loire. And he's somebody, again, I got to know tasting together, a professional and just very sharp taste, particularly sensitive on things like Brettanomyces. And yeah, I think I mentioned in the past that I think that all wine criticism needs to pivot to being something a bit more professional in some respects. And Johan's been an immense asset to us in that respect, because he's an extremely technical taster with a real sort of sensibility for great wines. And then there's also been Kristaps Karklins, the most recent new member of the team, a real wine lover. And we met in a restaurant in Chablis like a decade ago. And he was someone I also had in mind as somebody it would be interesting to have come work with us, a big champagne fanatic. And so he lives in Burgundy like me, and he's in Champagne probably every week, every 2 weeks. So he's going to be able to follow Champagne in a way that I never could. I'm proud of the work I did there, and I was trying to raise the level of our champagne coverage. But Cristeps is going to be able to take that to a whole new level entirely. So we're excited to have him on board as well.
Awesome. So then Johan will be taking over some of the Bordeaux stuff that you've been working on, and then Christophe will be handling champagne that you had also worked on, and you'll be focusing on Burgundy.
Exactly. Yeah. And Johan did a bit in champagne as well. So now Johan can really concentrate on. We can't have Johan sort of driving thousands of kilometers all the time. He has a wife and children and everything, and we're trying to also make work and actually avoid burning people out and making unreasonable demands of people while increasing the quality of the content we offer.
Yeah, that seems like those are two polar opposite things. So that all makes sense.
A little bit, maybe. Yeah. So some new recruits. We also have a few freelancers working for the Wine Advocate now. It's an interesting way to test out a cadre of younger people, and I think it's one of the few publications that's actually it's subscriber funded and it works that way still, and does really pretty well. So I think it's incumbent upon us to take the lead in trying to unearth people, including people Matthew had not. He'd done a little bit of writing for Decanter, but he's not somebody who a lot of people have heard of. But we gave him straight away a very important beat, and had a lot of competence. So if you find good tasters, and they're halfway literate, I think they can become quite good winemakers. And the main thing is to find the good tasters, people with a certain vision of wine. So yes, the recruitment quite a big deal, and I think embodies this sort of this broader vision of more professionalism. We've been trying to develop that with a lot of team training. We're about to do our next session in a couple of weeks now, and so everyone's coming to Beaune. We're all getting together to taste together. We have external contributors. Second year running now, we have a master parfumier, and so we're doing aroma training. There's such rigor to parfumiers compared to wine critics, right? You have to be able to pass your parfumier exam. You have to be able to recognize a long list of the active molecule ingredient in certain sense, and there's a right and a wrong answer. It's not just saying my auntie Betsy's raspberry jam. If it's raspberries or cassis, it's right or wrong. So I think we're trying to get much sharper on that aspect of a wine which is objectively present, let's say, because I think wine criticism inherently is always an uneasy. There's an element of tension, in fact, between the objective, which is a descriptive. We're trying to describe things that are actually present that other people will also independently be able to perceive, properties that are inherent to the wine. And the subjective, which is a question of taste. Do we like it? Does it move us? Those sorts of things. And those things all enter together into the score, which I think is what a lot of people's problem with scoring wines is that there are absolutely objective things that are being verified and assessed, and then there's an element of subjectivity. And I think wine criticism has to have both, right? Because if you don't have any taste, how could you have a vision for where a region's going, which producers are better than others? But if you're weak on the objective properties of the wine, how will your description be useful to a consumer? And what sort of credibility can you ultimately have in the face of other professionals who know the wines very well? So we're trying to sort of work on all of those things together, so that when you're subscribed to the Wine Advocate and you see 94 points and a certain description, you can really have a certain confidence to expect a certain level of experience and a certain correspondence between what's described and what's in the glass without free associative flights of fancy that some wine writing has sometimes tended to deliver. So yeah, no, it's just been busy, and those are things that take a little time for people to see, perhaps to notice. Maybe they don't notice them, but I'm certainly never been prouder of the work we're doing, and I think maybe we have a few other projects that might make a bit more noise that people might hear about in the future too. But those I shouldn't get into too explicitly before let's not count our chickens.
Yeah, awesome. Well, there's a number of things I want to touch on that you just got through, but the first one is the parfumier. I couldn't agree more. I went down for a little while, a little rabbit hole on the perfume thing, and I've gotten really deep into coffee as just like a passion outside of wine. And what I think is interesting is perfume in particular. It's not just like learning about these compounds in isolation and what they may or may smell like on their own. It's building that complexity and layers and seeing how they interact with each other together to create something larger, which is what happens in wine, and same thing in actually coffee. So I think that's interesting. You're having them there rather than just a single that Nuz de Van case where you can smell all these things by themselves, but they're not building something more complex or larger.
No, and to do that sort of training properly, as you said, that there are a lot of compounding effects and masking effects, and so isolating things can be really difficult. You really need very high quality essences to do it really meaningfully. So the native out thing is a good start, but really it's not as expensive as it would need to be really good. And we have an outside expert who comes and brings some sort of professional grade essences, and we focus on particular themes. I traded it, so we're doing a session in a few weeks on aromatic aromas, roasted, grilled, burnt aromas. Last year we looked at those, but in the context of sort of animal dimension, Brettanomyces, volatile phenols, guaiacol, and so on. This year I'm combining it with a visit to a cooperage. So we're taking more the line of exploring different sort of toasts of oak and things like that. And it's just objective, also selfishly, as a person who gets to decide what we do. It interests me a great deal, and I learn a lot from it myself. So and I know my colleagues do as well. But I'm certainly I'm having fun being in charge of the Canopies, let's say.
Awesome. So the other parts I wanted to touch on, I've gotten the pleasure to talk to Matt a couple times, which it's been great. You're spot on. He's really his enthusiasm, aside from his skill, is infectious. So it's always great to catch up with him and see how that's going. And then, as someone who worked a vintage in Australia and fell in love with a lot of those wines that you can't necessarily get everywhere, I still feel, regardless of how widely they're distributed, hopefully they will become more someday, or people will go get them. But I think it's great that you guys are shining more of a light on some of these, just because there's so many special things that don't make it out. So I think that's
that's for sure. And I followed from afar, but some of these things, like the Sami Odi wines, I was already tasting 15 years ago as a student. We got them. That was when I first discovered import VAT in the UK, because I thought, wow, this is expensive, but we'll pay. It'll be okay. It'll be delivered. And suddenly you get this tax, this bill, it doubles the price, and you think, wow, okay. And Rick Kunzbringer came to my student tasting group. I've been following these things for a while, and now it's cool to see Aaron giving a fresh take on contemporary Australian wine, which I think has very little to do with a lot of the stereotypes that American consumers may have about Australia, which is a lot of it was conditioned by the sort of early 2000s, a certain number of importers bringing in wines made almost explicitly for the American market and on a certain taste profile. And Australia is so much more than that, and New Zealand even was all other world as well. Yeah, no, I'm following along with interest. I wish I could find more of them to taste here in France now.
Yeah, certainly. On the same kind of vein of expanding the lens through which these criticisms are made, have you emphasized people or your team going more into the vineyards to get a better sense of how the wine's being made and what the vineyard processes are impacting those wines?
Yeah, I think wine criticism today is maybe a little bit of a fork in the road. There are two different models. One is clearly going to be to taste as many wines as possible, with a view to essentially serving the interests of the trade by providing shelf talkers and essentially sort of outsourced marketing materials in return for professional subscriptions. It's not even stigmatizing that, but that's just looking at the basic business model of certain publications. That's clearly how they're gonna have to operate to be viable. I think the other kind of model is to remain very consumer oriented, but also I think that implies a certain amount of focus, because the interest of the consumer are not served, I think, by trying to taste every single wine and to be master of everything but an expert on nothing. I think people want to know more about the most interesting wines. That reflects how people buy wine as well. 20 years ago, you bought from the selection you had on offer, so maybe comprehensive reviews of everything in the store would have been very helpful. Today, people identify wine that interests them, and then they go out and look for it via the internet, and that's just how the wine business works today. I don't see that ever changing. And so people want to know more about those wines. And the amount of information you can find for free in terms of insight on just by people posting social media and so on, which is not always accurate, but nevertheless, there's a great deal of information out there. How do you compete with that? How do you compete with organically user-generated content? You have to go deeper. You have to be boots on the ground, without forgetting that ultimately the final judge of quality is the wine in the glass, and the only stories that are really valid are the stories you can taste, right? So if people have a great process and talk a great talk, but the result just isn't compelling, it's the wine in the glass that decides. So I want to emphasize that as well. It's not, you don't go to the producer and spend the morning there and visit the vineyards and so on with a view to saying, oh, well, then the wines are definitively good just because the practices are good. The tasting component remains the focus, but the idea is to enrich the tasting component with much deeper insights, and also that I think critics develop that capacity to make a link between being able to assess quality of vineyard management and have an idea of winemaking processes to get a bit of a better filter, right? Because there are some things where things just don't add up and you should already be suspicious about how the wine is likely to be. If because you hear everything. I always say that people are coming up with a stupid marketing story in wine every 5 minutes, and I'm always the first one to hear it. As a critic, people try out all of their new lines on you. And the more of an objective relationship between like visibly verifiable indicators that you can see with your eyes you have, the more you're never immune to that or impervious to that, but the more you have a chance of filtering out some of the noise and getting to the sound.
Yeah. So I have 2-part question. Take whichever part first because they're slightly disparate. But one is on just the numerical scores and how that is juxtaposed with longer reviews. As I've worked selling wine over the years, you see the reviews have gotten longer and more detailed with more actual information, which is great. It's a great compliment to why the score ended up being what it is. But do you think that now the score alone, like I know you guys have the green emblem, is there more that is indicating quality and then people are looking less away from pure numbers, or do you think the numbers are still the be-all end-all?
No, I think as editor-in-chief, one of the things you have to do is essentially look at sort of the team's resource allocation. How do you allocate your time and energy? And one thing I'm also trying to get us to focus on is that the amount of energy, which is represented by words written in the case, is proportional to the interest of the wine. So I don't really want to see extremely long tasting notes for 85-point wines, right, with extremely long producer commentary on mediocre producers, unless there's some sort of teachable moment to be gleaned from that, and the wine would have been expected to have a very high score and doesn't, and so on. Then you can obviously expatiate and should give you justifications. But no, I think we need to get a bit more discipline about everything being proportional and adapted. And if you find yourself wanting to write this sort of long ecstatic tasting note for a wine that gets a relatively modest score, maybe you're you're trying to tell yourself something, and it should get a better score. So I think that's something where I think all wine publications must be struggling with this thing that you have a finite amount of hours of working hours and that infinite number of wines, essentially speaking. And how do you decide how you're going to cover and what? And our answer to that is to be focused on quality and to go a bit deeper.
Yeah, because I found at least people as especially like in your work, for example, a wine can be very good and you give a lot of great insight into how it's going to taste, and then maybe since you're not just throwing out 99s and 100s everywhere, it still gets like 96 plus maybe. But if you actually read it, you get a lot more understanding of what the wine may be, and it helps you understand based on what you like as well. Like it might be more of your alley. Yeah, so I think that's.
I think we're definitely also trying to hold the line against the score inflation, because inflation of a currency is not in anyone's interest. It makes money cheap, and the inflation of scores makes scores cheap. I think it's a problem that you're seeing. Consumers, I don't know where you look at some of the reviews of certain wine regions, and how do you even pick a 100-point wine? There are so many to choose between. So I think wine critics overall, they made themselves a lot of friends in the trade in a sense by doing that, because I think the trade maybe arguably somewhat naively just assumes that a good score is going to sell wine, and the more good scores you have from as many critics as possible, the better your sales will be. But we're beginning to see that it doesn't work like that anymore. And look at the sort of fiasco of Bordeaux and Primeur the last couple of years. You can have as many high scores as you like from as many minor publications that subsist via advertising budgets and whatnot, or whatever, or just people who are perhaps naturally very enthusiastic, let's say, if you wish. But it won't necessarily sell the wine anymore in a way that 20 years ago, when scores maybe had a bit more impact, it did. So we're trying to keep it keep it tight and keep it reasonable and not get too incontinent with the big numbers. But sometimes there are very good wines. Also, it's not about saying everything just scored 4 points lower. I want to be the highest scorer on the great wines and the lowest scorer on the boring ones. I want as much differentiation as possible.
That makes sense. A lot of, to like more polar and less like middling,
clear, right?
Everything on one side. Yeah.
Don't hedge.
On the note you bring up Entrepreneur, that was going to be my second question, is for these wines that are meant to age and develop over time. We actually just had Mark Hochar on from Chateau Moussard the other day, and he was talking about how when their wines are young, they're put in like Bordeaux flights. When they get older, they're put in Burgundy flights. How do you gauge what cadence to go back and review a wine? Because I think it's coming up more and more where it'll get an Entrepreneur score, it'll get a bottled score, it'll get a score after 3 years and then 10 years from the same people. And I don't know, is there a pressure to keep the score the same? Are people doing this like on a regular cadence, or is it just when they come up in flights?
I think you got to the heart of the matter, which is that I think a lot of critics don't like to disagree with themselves. The very nature of Entrepreneur tasting, for example, in Bordeaux, you're tasting very, very early. As a producer myself, in my spare time, I'm aware of how unreliable those results, particularly if it's a single instance, can be. And there are far too many wines that land right in the middle of the bracketed score for Entrepreneur for that to be actually a plausible account of how things have actually transpired. I don't know. It's a resource allocation thing, and it's time. This year I'm going to do a big horizontal of 2005 Bordeaux because it's a vintage a lot of people got very excited about. Very big claims were made for its quality. A lot of people have those wines in their cellar and have been waiting patiently to open them. So it seems worth doing. By the same token, life is just too short, unfortunately. But that's also, I'd like to do more of those sorts of tastings, but that's intention with reviewing new releases also. So it's how do you strike the balance? Entrepreneur used to review most of the 80s, 90s, early 2000s, about 450 wines. By 2010, that had gone up to over 1,000, and we got up to a stage in the mid 2010s when we were doing 2,000 wines in Bordeaux Entrepreneur. What consumer wants to needs 2,000 options to choose between? I just don't think that's normal. Normal wine buyers don't need that. I think 400 was just fine. If you do 400, you have a lot more time to do horizontal tastings 10 years, 20 years on, things like that, which are very interesting to consumers actually, but maybe not so interesting to the trade. And once you started reviewing wines, you get a lot of pressure. The people writing say, well, why are you not reviewing me this year? And it can be a bit delicate. So I think wine criticism, the whole, maybe traps itself a little into a corner and got this sort of staccanovite. You've got to taste thousands of wines, just keep on churning it out at the expense of depth and of insight, and taking the time to do some of those more interesting things. Yeah, we ought to do more of those, and I wish I personally had time. But I also have now quite a big administrative burden. I don't think people can imagine how big an administrative burden I have in terms of managing it. There are probably 30 people who in various capacities are involved with producing the Wine Advocate, and now I'm in a sort of corporate structure, so it's just a lot more time than ideal for me having a lot of time to reviewing. So I think over time I need to step away from reviewing, and just I think the editorial role should really probably be separate from the tasting role, actually, if you want to keep a productivity application like this.
That makes sense. That's interesting. I was going to also just one more note on these. If one publication is having multiple scores, what I've seen from some merchants, and the most discerning will put the most recent first, but I've seen a lot of people just put whatever the highest score was. So if it was released and it was 100 points, then later it's tasted again 5 years later and got 92 or whatever, they will just keep posting the 100-point score and just roll with it.
Absolutely, yeah. People are very cynical, and then the working assumption behind that, I think, is that consumers are stupid. I don't think that they are. So I think those sorts of you have an inflated review of a mediocre wine. You can sell it to somebody once. Good luck trying to do that a second time. Let's say you kill whole regions and you kill consumer relations with merchants. It's a very, very, very short-term policy. Right now, the wine market is in a bit of a crisis, and I understand people are scrambling to do anything they can to sell wine. But if you do that at the expense of your reputation and credibility, then in the long term, I don't think you're going to do so well. So, yeah, I absolutely. I receive offers with all of the reviews that sometimes I'm quoted, all sorts of things, and it's sometimes quite ridiculous. You see what people People will do. They'll take the critical review saying this wine was not very good, and they'll just quote the very good practically. I'm putting quotes very good within Kelley. But you need that. I don't think people read these offers very much. I think people just scroll to the bottom. So
Yeah.
I don't lose too much sleep over it. And I think the way wine is sold is going to change so much over the next 10 years. So.
Well, that's what I was getting at. Is I think a lot of the people who are making these offers in these websites now were the ones that all they needed to do was put a shelf talker on, and nobody ever double checked them in a grocery store. They're still trying to do that same model, and now it's a completely different information age, and everything's at our fingertips, and you can't just get away with doing that anymore. Yeah,
exactly, and that's going to happen so fast. I think the wine business is going to look very, very different very soon, and a lot of things are. But it's so easy to find reviews now as well. If you use AI for searching for reviews and things. Good luck to the sort of guys out there who make a business out of copying and pasting scores into Excel. And that's not the future of the wine trade.
Yeah. Well, unless ChatGPT starts writing its own scores, which it not saying taking over, but sometimes you'll ask it for something and it'll have 2 or 3 that are actually real, and then one it wrote itself, and you're like, who knows? So AI is getting close, but not quite there.
It's funny. I should try that out just for my amusement, but the reviews are far too positive.
Yeah, they are.
It's always looking for something nice to say. So then,
oh yeah, it'll say whatever.
It'll be like,
and it'll pepper in one piece that's like accurate, and you're like, oh man, maybe.
Because there were some publications I long wondered if they were written by bots, and I was curious to see what bots could actually do, but no, or maybe yes.
All right, well, let's pivot over a little bit to the work that you've been doing with some of your own stuff. The one of the reasons why it was so interesting for me to be in the vineyard with you is you kind of work with this trissage method inspired by Lalou Bize-Leroy. Can you talk a little bit about just in general how maybe pruning techniques have come a long way in terms of the thinking recently, and why that might be, and what you're doing in your vineyard?
Well, pruning, let's make the distinction between pruning and canopy management, but they're both very interesting subjects. And as an historian by training, I naturally look at these things in a certain perspective. And when you look at, so grafting obviously comes around after phylloxera in a big way in the early 20th century, late 19th, early 20th century is when that really got underway in an important degree. And by the 1920s, 1930s, people started having big problems with the vines deteriorating in vigor and degenerating and growing poorly and yields going down. And so they started looking into it. And there's a guy called Guillaume who wrote a big book. I've got it up on the shelf there. And it's been Rob Walters in Australia who did a re-edition of it with a translation, which is pretty cool. And they essentially figured out that the way the vines were being pruned, and after the grafting wound, which fundamentally sets back the vigor of the vine, and also this is also when cane pruning was much more widely adopted throughout France. They found that it was the impeded sap flows was the problem. And so they started figuring out ways to prune in a way that preserved living tissue and was respectful of sap flows. And so a lot of old vineyards in Burgundy from the 20s and 30s, you see formed into these sorts of structures. And then along came the decline of rural populations, lack of local labor and more contract labor, more people who had grown up around vines, people who didn't have the same connection over time with the parcels, and just need to do things quickly. And the pruning went back to being simplified and not respecting the sap flow. Often these sort of bilateral sap flows, often one was cut off with a saw. Really, you can see it written in the vine, these old vines today. Because you see this beautiful bilateral system was created, and then this huge cut has been made at some point, and it's been simplified. And lo and behold, you start to have all these issues with trunk disease, with esca, related to fungi getting into dead tissue in the trunk, and so on. And we go back to the same problems, and the solution is still the same. It's still very respectful pruning. You see, I think, the sort of enlightened producers now for quite a while, but it's still a big issue for a lot of estates, a lot of regions going back to more respectful pruning systems of sap flow. But trying to manage the labor component of that is hard, and this is why you need sometimes external consultants, and the most famous is Marco Simonet. It's really more a human problem than it is a viticultural problem in some ways. But the results can be pretty amazing in terms of increased productivity and If your vineyard lives 10 years longer, even, that can be a massive financial plus for a winery, if nothing else. But then, the more radical stuff that's going on, especially in Burgundy, is people experimenting finally with different methods of managing canopies. Historically, since the post-war period, the canopies in Burgundy have all been adapted to accommodate these over-row tractors that have a clearance of about 1.30 meters. So you have to keep the vines very low to the ground, and you trim them 1 meter, 1.30 meters. And that has some other advantages. If you have a lot of mildew pressure, you're cutting off the part of the canopy that's most susceptible to that. So there's sort of sanitation reasons why it'd be good. And if you're looking to have reflected heat from the soil, obviously it's good to be close to the ground. But we're not very interested in having reflected heat anymore. Mildew you can manage. And so it's really interesting to start letting the canopies go higher. Now, if you hedge higher, you're still cutting the apex, right? The vine's brain, if you like, is the apex, the tip of the apical shoot, right? This produces hormones like auxins that make it grow up. It also makes the roots grow down. Same way, if you look at like lawn grass versus prairie grass grows tall and has deep roots. Lawn grass grows very dense, short, and has very shallow roots. It makes turf, right? So vineyards, vines are plants like other plants, and tend to have, there's some things in common in the way that most plants behave, actually, if you look at it. And so if you can go a bit higher and not cut the tip stuff, you encourage less of this sort of lateral growth. So whereas if you're hedging high, you're making essentially a solar panel, and you can easily get very high evapotranspiration because you've got a lot of young lateral growth, and you've got a lot of photosynthesis going on. You get very high sugars, high alcohols. What people are doing, and Lalou was the first person to start doing it in Burgundy beginning in 1999, is that you're not creating that solar panel effect, but you're getting the shade benefits. If you're removing the laterals manually, your canopies, actually, the leaves are actually quite old, so the requirements in terms of water are reduced. They're more robust, and so you don't get crazy sugars, and you get beautiful quality tannins, and fresh flavors. This is the ideal, right? You can also have a situation where your canopy is unmanageable, you get mildew in it, and the whole thing is disastrous, and you have a tiny yield because you've lost a lot to disease. So it's not without risks. It entails around 1,500 man-hours per hectare to do it, so it's very expensive. But I think it's quite an interesting technique. Again, similarly, I talked about a bit of a bifurcation in wine criticism. I think there's also going to be a bit more very radical. There is already radical sort of segmentation in the wine market between wines that people will still accept spending large amounts of money on and very passionate about. And it's a dream as well as a bottle of wine, if you like. And Burgundy is in a lucky situation of people have a certain expectation of that here, and so it works. And then beverage wines, which are competing with all sorts of other manners of alcoholic beverages, and also the fact that people are overall drinking less. So what we're talking about here is a technique which is very firmly situated in the former camp in terms of being an appropriate process. But that's clearly, people always say, what's going to happen to wine as people drink less, right? I think it's the same. What would you have said 20 years ago? What's going to happen to the watch market with smartphones? And in fact, the high-end watch market has never been more robust and more successful. And I think wine is going to be segmented a bit like that. But you don't want to be in the business of selling like very cheap throwaway timepieces, because everybody has a clock on their smartphone. But I think you're just fine making Rolexes, right? And I think wine's going to be like that. And I wouldn't be surprised to see consumption patterns return to how they were 60, 70 years ago, when there was a much smaller population of people drinking wine. The economics of the business were very different. There was ultimately a much smaller acreage internationally under vine and so on. But wine was doing just fine. And many of the great estates that we know and dream about today were absolutely functioning in that period. And so it's not. So a lot of this sort of crisis in wine is I think maybe exaggerated vis-a-vis sorts of wines that we're interested in drinking. Anyway, it's a bit of a tangent, but it's just to underline that it's really not a practical technique for most growers, but it's a super interesting technique if your objective is really no compromise excellence.
Yeah. No, I think, well, taking a step away, going on your analogy there, I think what's interesting with the watch analogies. I think they already had that moment back in when like digital watches came into effect.
Right.
And then people were like, well, these nice people, and then they stayed on. And I think with the phones coming, it's almost like the other innovations that are happening in the wine world now, whether it be like non-alcoholic wine or natural wines and things. It's almost like this third wave, and it's like the highest, like you were saying, the most traditional, or like these wines that have always been here, like the Rolexes of wine, are continuing to power through as these other innovations and things kind of come and go. So I think that's a really great analogy along those lines. Yeah, and then in terms of vines, I'm trying to take what I've learned from you. Even I have a little grapevine here in a pot that I'm growing, and now it's up here, and trying to explain to my wife how she's like trying to get me to pull leaves in certain places. I'm like, no, these are powering the vine. So it's been a fun little thing. But anyway, one question from when we were in the vineyard. I don't know if this was like a joke or not, but are people actually anywhere using tiger poop from a zoo to ward off?
I was told by a producer in the Languedoc, who perhaps I won't name, that he was being bothered with foxes, because any readers of Aesop know foxes like grapes, right? And so he's being bothered by foxes eating his grapes. And foxes actually, like most wild animals, are vectors for Brett, apparently, somebody was telling me. So anyway, you don't want, and they stink anyway. They smell foxy. You don't want that around your fruit. You certainly don't want anybody eating your fruit, mangling your clusters. Great way to get fruit flies, VA, all of those nasty things. And yeah, so he had gone to the sort of local zoo and gotten some tiger manure, I guess we could call it, and left it around. And he found that there was just nothing, and nobody wanted to. That was sending out a very strong signal. I was told that by this Languedoc producer who was tasting in a cellar in Burgundy at the same time I was there, because I was being bothered by badgers at one point in one of my vineyards, which was there's a badger trying to dig up a fruit tree that I'd planted at the end of the parcel, and then he said, "Oh, well, you need to go to the zoo and so on." But there's the nearest zoo with tigers to where I am is too long away for me to be experimenting with that, honestly. But it's a funny story.
Yeah, I'm glad to hear it was real. I left, and then I told some MW friends, and they were like, I think he might have just been messing with you. I was like, I don't know.
It's been known to happen, but no, because someone may have been messing with me, but that's what I was told. But quite a reputable Languedoc producer, let's say.
Interesting. Well, all right, cool. Well, we get closer to the end here. I wanted to talk about the recent vintages in Burgundy, and we can talk about this in relation to the wines you make since you're on the ground, but also what you've been tasting. What, I guess, stylistically, have you seen I guess we'll just work our way up 2022, 23, and what the growing season was like in 2024.
Yeah, I might take it slightly differently, and
sure.
So look at how vintages have been appreciated and how we've been thinking about vintages lately. And I think this sort of trifecta of 18, 19, 20, hot, sunny, dry, high UV, high alcohol, in some cases high acidity, very high polyphenols in all three. Those sorts of that sort of trifecta, I think, trick people into thinking that that's going to be the new normal, and they're all going to be like that. And 22 was also very hot and dry with a lot of very high UV index as well. But in the midst of all that, we've had 21, which was frosty, cool vintage of only moderate maturity, much more in line with the sort of taste in some ways of Burgundy from the 90s, but without the structural austerity. And then now we had 23, which is very high crop, and I think maybe a bit schizophrenic between the reds and the whites. And the whites, these sort of rather thick, unctuous, powerful whites, like maybe a more powerful version of 17, if you like. And 17 in white was quite a ripe vintage as well. I think people underestimate that. Maybe think of something like 1992, if you like, or 1983, if you want to go back to other vintages. And then the reds, which are generally speaking they're certainly invariably pretty supple and open, just because of the yield. It's not this sort of monster corn ass looking like black wines in the glass. And now 24, which was definitely, I said this about Bordeaux, I'll say it about Burgundy as well. Clearly the most challenging vintage of the last 20 years, I think. Historically low yields at many estates, much lower than in 21 or 16, which were frost vintages. Just unprecedented attacks of mildew, and then very unfavorable weather. Let's be honest. During the harvest, right, there was some of the ripest vineyards were creeping up towards 11 and a half, and then we got, I think, 115. How much was it? Over an inch of rain, actually, just and then cool. The one thing you can say was it was so cool that Botrytis never really got going to its full extent, and it's clearly the most difficult since 2004 in Burgundy, I would say probably. Well, certainly not nothing remotely like those sort of sunny, stereotypically global warming vintages that I think, going back to where our psychology was coming out of 2020, I think everybody just thought the only challenge we're going to have is climate change. And it's very clear that that's not the case. So far, 2025 looks really, really good. It's the most promising growing season I've seen in a decade of following it on the ground. We had the same flowering dates as 1865, which is maybe one of the probably the greatest vintage in the 19th century. It's early, but it's not ridiculously early. We're about to have a warm day, but I'm talking like 90 Fahrenheit, not 100. Obviously, there's the whole of July and August is about to play out. But so far so good. But not so far. In extreme vintages, there's been a lot of water. There was a big drought between 18, 19, 20. There was a lot of rain in winter, spring 18, and then the tap was cut off for 3 years. Essentially, a lot of trees in the Haute Côte were dying, and so everything suffered. Right now, you could say either are we in remission, or how exactly will the 1.5 degrees centigrade over X period of time play out for Burgundy's climate?
Yeah,
cool. We'll see. But I think it'll be a late August for some people, mainly early September harvest this year.
Well, all right, cool. Well, we'll definitely keep our eyes on Burgundy and I guess Bordeaux again this year, and hopefully the growing season will remain consistent and good. But I think that's a great place to leave this conversation. So thanks so much, William, for joining us again.
My pleasure.
All right, that was our interview with William Kelley. I hope everybody found it as fascinating as I did. Everybody go check out what they're doing there at the Wine Advocate. But for now, that is our episode for this week. Despite me traveling, we will be back with another 5 questions on Friday and a full episode next week. Cheers.